What's up, Frog Fanatics? Hopefully, you're all having an awesome day. We're back here for episode number 3 of our Dimir Deep Dive series, where today we're looking at the Dimir Oculus versus Eldrazi Ramp matchup. The new Eldrazi list that showed up at RC Prague under the hands of Fur MTG, fantastic Moto Grinder, and paper player, obviously. We're taking a look at the list that he just came in top 8 at Prague with. I think it's like going to be the go-to list for the next few weeks. So we're going to try to break it down. We're going to look at what to look for as soon as you find out you're up against Eldrazi in an open deck list event, your mulligan decisions on the play and the draw, play patterns to look for, sideboarding, card evaluations, post-board mulligan decisions and play patterns, and some additional tips, tricks here and there to wrap up the video. So if you're enjoying this kind of commentary, this kind of content, feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the YouTube channel, greatly helps out. And as always, really appreciate all the feedback everybody gives, really enjoying the positivity. So stay tuned, we'll go ahead and hop into it and see if we can make this a good video. First things first, you've gotten your pairing, you see that your opponent's on Eldrazi. What are you looking for to help kind of inform your mulligan decisions, some of your early play patterns going forward? 3 things that I like to take notice of. 1, is it Teamer or is it just Gruul? For the most part, this matters more for sideboarding. Main deck, the only real difference is Null Drifter. But being able to recognize if your opponent's on Teamer and might have access to the line of evoking a Null Drifter to not flashback, but exile a Kozilek's Return from their yard for a lot cheaper than casting something like Devourer of Destiny is extremely important. The second big thing, does your opponent have any copies of Cavern of Souls in their deck? Some lists do, some don't. I don't know if there's much of a rhyme or reason. I'm not an Eldrazi expert, but you need to know if the card is present as a tutor target for a Sowing Myco spawn. And then 3, is your opponent on Karn the Great Creator or not? The only reason this really matters is when it comes to getting to like that 3-4 mana position, knowing what your opponent has access knowing what your opponent has access to at that point can really inform a lot of your decisions onto or regarding when to tap out, when to play a little bit slower, what your opponent can do if you have to commit to the battlefield and you know they're going to get to resolve something. I think the stock Gruul lists are all on Karn at the moment, so don't be too surprised about that one. But every now and then you'll run into lists that just go heavier on the creature side or might have a couple extra talismans, ramp spells, stuff like that, and forego the Karn for those pieces. So just keep an eye out for what your opponent can do, because that'll let you know how worrisome you need to be about things like Eldrazi Temple versus an Ugin's Labyrinth in the early turns of the game. All right, so you've taken a look at their list, you sat down, shuffled up, you won the die roll, you're on the play. What kind of an opening hand are you looking for? If I had to craft my perfect opener against the Eldrazi builds, it would be something like 2 untapped lands, a Thoughtseize of Frog, Oculus Unearth, and a counter spell. Obviously, we can't have the perfect hand every time, so we need to start thinking about what is or is not acceptable out of those cards to make a functional 7, or if we need to look towards mulliganing pretty aggressively. Now, in the Eldrazi matchup, I would suggest mulliganing fairly aggressively for a threat, especially on the play, and especially if your hand can't support finding something quickly. But if you do keep a hand without a Psychic Frog or an Oculus, you run the risk of running into cast triggers too soon, not being able to take advantage of the first couple turns of setup. And if your opponent is able to get to those points for their hard casting Devourer of Destinies, kicking, Sowing Myco spawns, casting Ulamog's, or casting Emrakul's, the game's pretty much over at that point. So your goal for your opening hand needs to be a Frog on 2, Oculus on 3 is okay if you can start off the game with like a Thought Seize into a counterspell into an Oculus. But Frog on 2 is your preferred threat by a mile. And you'll notice that's a trend across a lot of the matchup guides on the play. If you got a Frog on turn 2, you've got a pretty good chance of winning that game. Frog on 2, Thought Seize on 1, really nice. Force a negation to follow up a frog, really good on the play, much better on the play than the draw. Uh, and I'll tell you why when we get to the play pattern section. But Thoughtseize on 1, obviously nice. Frog, force or counterspell as a preferred follow up. If you can find a secondary threat, it's okay. But on the play, really, if you can just go all in on a frog early, and when I say all in, I mean ditching 3 or 4 cards in the first turn or two and really trying to close out the game in the fewest amount of combat steps possible. Don't give your opponent time to start setting up with Myco spawns or get to their devourers, something like that. So you need to keep opening hands that are as aggressive as possible on the play. On the draw, things get a little bit dicier. Thoughtseize kind of becomes your de facto best card possible. You really want the ability to interact with whatever their follow-up play is to their turn 1. So if they lead turn 1 with a Ugin's Labyrinth into a Talisman, then you want to be able to Thoughtseize and take away that Karn on 2 or the Sowing Myco spawn, the stuff that you can't interact with Spell Snare, and you probably aren't going to have a great ability to force negation. Force itself, pretty good on the draw. Obviously, it's only going to be as good as the threat that you're protecting. That's why I say it's better on the play because you really get to push the issue with like an early frog protected with force immediately. On the draw, you might have to use that early force for something like a Chalice of the Void if that's in your opponent's list. But being able to slam a turn 2 frog with force for a Karn or force for Trinisphere, whatever, really good to help you have a chance of pulling ahead on the draw. But if you don't have a force, Thoughtseize is still top priority. So a hand with Thoughtseize into a frog is better than most 7s, most 6s, but don't be afraid to keep a hand with a frog and a force and a blue spell, or at worst, like a Thoughtseize into an Oculus or something like that. But you don't want to keep a hand in game 1 that doesn't have the ability to get on the board ASAP. If you're playing Harbinger of the Seas, you open up a little bit on your mulligan decisions. So being able to find opening hands that have cantrips or thought scours and unearths and try to high roll flipping over an Oculus or a Harbinger gives you a few more outs. But if you're not on a Harbinger in the main, you need to have a frog on 2 as much as you can possibly mold to that. If not, you got to have an Oculus on 3 or you're probably going to get run over very, very quickly. So let's hop into the play patterns. We talked a little bit during the Breach matchup guide about how it's really important to be fairly versatile with your interaction. Eldrazi is kind of on the opposite end here, where being flexible is a benefit against some of these combo decks with knowing when to take payoffs, when to fight over enablers. In the Eldrazi matchup, especially game 1, it's more about having a defined plan and trying to stick to that as much as possible. The reason being, especially post-board, your interaction choices at different times in the game build on themselves. For example, with the card Thoughtseize in game 1, you have the option to take something early like a a Malevolent Rumble or a Myco Spawn, maybe a Talisman, to try to stop your opponent from getting to those big payoffs. But you don't have the ability to stop those big payoffs anyway if they get to them. So you're really trying to fight on this mana denial plan where if you don't have Harbinger in the deck, you're not equipped to take advantage of that stumbling by kind of shutting them out. So you need to come up with a mental tier list of what kind of things you're looking for with cards like Early Thoughtseize. For me, first priority is if my opponent reveals a Devourer of Destiny as a pregame action, there is a very good chance that I'm going after that Devourer with the Thoughtseize. Not to try to stop the pregame actions because you can't do that, but because it's a cast trigger that says get rid of your threat on cast. And I have no way of stopping that in the main deck outside of the Thoughtseize. If I choose to Thoughtseize something else, there's a chance I won't see another one, and they're just going to get to exile my Frog or my Oculus, whatever I'm leaning on to close out the game. After Devourer, Kozilek's Command. The reason I don't put Kozilek's Command above Devourer on the list is because I can still Force of Negation or Counterspell or Spell Pierce or even Sink into Stupor, a Kozilek's Command, but I can't use those pieces of interaction on the Devourer. Now, obviously, there is a little bit of wiggle room. There's always exceptions to every rule. And the exception to the Devourer rule would be if my opponent's sitting there with like a one land hand with a Labyrinth and a Talisman, I'm taking the Talisman. I'm trying to high roll them missing that green mana and not being able to fire off Myco Spawns or Malevolent Rumbles or anything of the sort. But if I see that they've got an Ugin's Lab, an Eldrazi Temple, a Talisman, double Myco Spawn, and a Devourer, I'm not sitting here and trying to shut them off with taking a Talisman or assume they're going to miss land drops with their 20 whatever land deck and Myco Spawns. I'm going after the payoff to try to give me the best chance of getting my threat across the finish line. After Devourer and K Command, Emrakul is probably the next biggest priority on my list. And it's mostly because it's a card that we can't really beat if they cast, and we don't have the right answers at that moment. So it's definitely a card that they can just put on the stack middle or late game and end everything in that one turn cycle. So I don't want that coming up if I can help it. If you got a Frog, you're going in on that Frog super aggressive. I know I mentioned that in the Mulligan decisions, but a lot of times you'll have hands that involve a turn 2 Frog, turn 3 discard 5 cards, keep a counter spell in hand because the rest of your hand is just Fatal Push, shoot the Sheriff, some other like a Graveyard Trespasser, Unearth, whatever. Obviously not Graveyard Trespasser Unearth because you want to get that extra threat, but you get the idea. Just some extra cards that don't really do anything. They might be cantrips that could potentially find something. They could be just dead spell snares, Stern Scolding, whatever. Throwing all that into Frog as soon as I can because I got to get the game over with. The best way to do that is a big Frog that can snowball, attack in for a good chunk of damage, potentially fly over something like a Myco Spawn if they do end up casting one or two. A lot of the times it involves ignoring Karn if you can get a lethal attack through. And counterspell aggressively. Especially, this is all referring to game one. If you've got spell snares and your opponent puts a Malevolent Rumble on the stack, counter it. Just use your cards as aggressively as you can, because if you get to that late part of the game and they do get to cast trigger territory, your counter spells aren't doing anything then. So being able to interact with what you can interact with early gives you a better chance of seeing an extra turn or two to get a threat across the finish line instead of trying to save those counters and say, oh, well, I can counter the body on the Devourer and they'll still get to exile something, but the body's not there. Again, there's always an exception to everything. If you do have just like Oculus going wide, then maybe you're okay with counters, like waiting on the counter spell to hit the Devourer to stop the body and keep swinging in with 2 or 3 tokens. But you got to recognize when the hand is set up for that and not just use that as your starting point for forming a game plan from the very beginning. The final play pattern to keep an eye out for involves Emrakul itself. So there's 2 aspects to this play pattern. One is if you have a good board presence, and I'm assuming that they cast Emrakul and the game is not ending on the spot. What I mean by that is you're not dead to them getting an attack in with the Emrakul. Maybe you're at 16, 17 life, whatever. They can't completely destroy your board when they take your extra turn. Things you need to look for in that position: counterspelling or sink into stupor on the Emrakul can be a very powerful tool. Obviously keeps the body off the board, but it allows you to keep from having your turn be a big blowout most of the time, because all your opponent can really do is not attack in, give you your extra turn, and then maybe you can put enough pressure to finish the game or create a bigger board state. So if they Emrakul the next turn again, like let's say you sink into super the Emrakul in the stack, the Emrakul again, you might be able to swing around it with things like Oculus or Graveyard Trespasser attack triggers. And then the second thing is if you are getting Emrakul and you can't counterspell it, can't sink into stupor, pay attention to the resources that you have available to you. So if you've got a frog out and your opponent casts their Emrakul, trigger on the stack, trigger resolves, then before they go to your next turn, it might be worth discarding anything you can to the frog. Your opponent's going to make you do it anyway, but making sure that you're discarding like fatal pushes or counter spells that can be used to counter your own things, or not necessarily the counter spell, but the removal spells really make you not be able to kill your own Psychic Frog and Oculus on your turn. And if you have like a fetch and a Surveil open, it can be a really good idea to go ahead and use that fetch and Surveil before they take your turn. Maybe you see something dead on top of the library, like a redundant counter spell that you can keep there to stop them from having an extra card to mess with you too much. It's not always going to be something you have the option to do, but it's good to know that's something to look out for if the situation does arise. So let's hop on to sideboarding. Sideboarding, the most exciting part of every video in this series, and I think the part that trips most people up when they're unsure of what to do. All about having a game plan. That's the easiest explanation I can give. So for a sideboard like what we've got on the screen right here, Harbinger of the Seas, obviously pretty easy bring in, great to help fight some of the mana. It's not going to be good enough by itself. Harbinger is really good at slowing down the double colorless costs on things like Devourer or Kozilek's Command, but you still have to deal with green mana production. You still have to deal with Myco spawns and world breakers and malevolent rumbles, making spawn tokens, Karns, all that stuff. So don't think you can just windmill slam and Harbinger and win the game, but it's obviously coming in. Mystical Dispute, even if they're a teamer variant, you might have a chance to Mystical Dispute to fight over an opposing dispute, but probably not the battle you want to pick. So I'd leave them in the sideboard. Stern Scolding's not hitting anything. Consigned to Memory. I'm a big believer that Eldrazi is popular enough. I would not be caught dead without the full 4 consigned to memory. I know there's people going down to 3. If you're playing main deck Harbinger and you have a little bit better of a chance of winning that game 1, maybe boarding into like a third Harbinger in the side, I can kind of get wanting to cut down to 3. But myself personally, I will have the full 4 on my board and will not compromise on that one. Uh, Engineered explosives. I've seen some people want to bring it in. If your opponent is running Chalice of the Void, like 4 Chalice of the Void, not just one to get off Karn, full 4, then I would say take a look at the EE. It is an Alta Chalice. You don't want to just get caught with one landing while you're sitting there with a bunch of consigns in hand. We'll get to that interaction in the post board play patterns, but spell bomb. Um, some people like to have a spell bomb or two to try to stop Emrakul triggers. It's okay if you have enough stuff to cut out of the main, but I would have spell bomb below Harbinger and Consign on my list of things to bring in. Things that I'm cutting. Most of the cantrips pretty much aren't changing in effectiveness for your post board. So they're really staying regardless. Stern Scolding's getting cut. I'm cutting all my fatal pushes. If I have something like Shoot the Sheriff in the deck, I can consider bringing or keeping it in just to fight over some big Eldrazi. At the end of the day, I don't think it's raising or lowering your percentage points by a substantial amount. So I wouldn't be too disappointed if you kept them or cut them. And then I'm probably cutting like a single copy of Unearth just because Kozilek's command does have the mode to exile a card from the graveyard or X cards from the graveyard. So you don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to unearth an Oculus early into open mana and your opponent just has the ability to fight over that. It's not a super common interaction that comes up. Usually they're more interested in exiling a frog, or if you don't have a threat, just making a bunch of spawns and drawing a card. But you don't want to get stuck in a situation where you have to hope your opponent makes a different move than they have available to them to make. You know what I mean? So if you're looking at like 4 push getting cut, Stern Scolding this list getting cut, and Unearth, that's 6 slots. Bring in 2 Harbinger, 4 consigned to memory. Pretty much call it a day. And then if you want to cut some number of like Spell Snare for Nihil Spellbomb, I get it. It doesn't follow along with my game plan. My game plan in the post 4 games is leaning heavily into Harbinger of the Seas unless I just have like a turn 2 frog that can go crazy. Thawed Season to frog into double consigned to memory, discard the rest of my hand. Otherwise, I'm leaning into Harbinger of the Seas. So I want the ability to fight over Malevolent Rumbles and Talismans very aggressively so that Harbinger can come down with no colorless mana available. And we'll get to that when we talk about sideboard play patterns. But from the Tron side, what are they boarding in? What are they boarding out? If they're a list with Karn, they probably have a good 10 slots or so dedicated to their Karn sideboard. Much less sideboarding going on in those builds, usually just like a couple copies of Dismember coming in, and that's about all they can really afford. If you're not dealing with the Karn build, they might have Veil of Summer. I've seen Ghost Vacuum in some lists, but Veil's kind of the big one. And what are they cutting? Some number of expensive things, like maybe a World Breaker. I know that it's got reach, but at the end of the day, it's just a 7 mana vanilla dude that doesn't specifically exile a creature. So I do think Devourer has a little more equity over World Breaker. Maybe trimming an Emrakul just because you don't want your Emrakul being consigned. It's a big feels bad when you pay 13 mana for something and your opponent just gets to say no for 2. Um, on our side, Long Goodbye. If you got Long Goodbye in the deck, that's getting cut. And some extra options that I wanted to bring up Dolphy Voidwalker, we mentioned it in the Breach matchup. Some people have really enjoyed trying it out there. If you've got the sideboard space, you're probably bringing it in the Tron matchup. The reason being, Dolphy Voidwalker combined with Thoughtseize can allow you to exile something like a World Breaker or an Emrakul the Promised End out of your opponent's hand and sack your Dolphy to cast that spell and create a very big advantage, whether it be Emrakul taking their turn or World Breaker exiling a land on their side. Mycos Vaughn tutoring up a land's a little less exciting, but some of the big payoff Eldrazi can be really nice off of a Dolphy Voidwalker. Ceremonious Rejection. If you're running, I know Consigned to Memory is just a power creep Ceremonious Rejection. I get that. But if you're on 4 Consign already and you're thinking about an extra slot that you want to dedicate specifically to Tron, Ceremonious Rejection is an option that you can have, especially good if you're expecting a bunch of builds with like Trinisphere and Chalice of the Void that you need to interact with early. Summary Dismissal is one that I've thought about a few times recently. Let me pull that one up while I'm thinking about it. So it's a 4-mana instant. There you go. It's a 4-mana instant from what? Yeah, Eldritch Moon that says exile all other spells and counter all abilities. It's really good if your opponent does something like put a big cast trigger Eldrazi on the stack, sacrifice their Sanctum of Ugin, because Summary Dismissal will hit the Eldrazi, the cast trigger on the Eldrazi, the sack trigger on the Sanctum of Ugin, get all of that out at one time. And because it's exiling a spell off the stack instead of countering it, it counters the abilities, but it exiles the spell. So it gets around things like Cavern of Souls. If you're just looking for another way to interact with cast triggers, Summary Dismissal is an option. Tishana's Tidebinder is one that can like stifle an activated ability. Reason I'm not so big on Tishana's Tidebinder is you're basically never getting in an attack with the body. If you do stifle a World Breaker trigger or a Devourer of Destiny trigger, something like that, you're never attacking through that with a Tidebinder. Then the last option to potentially bring in is Break the Ice. It's one that I've really liked out of like the Death Shadow builds. Thoughtseize into Break the Ice, really, really good for kind of clearing the way of payoff and setting them back on lands. Break the Ice, however, can be kind of awkward with Harbinger of the Seas with getting the mana available. If you have a Harbinger down, you're probably not going to be able to cast Break the Ice at all. But if you are on like a more heavy black build with, say, Dolphy in the main, you might have 2 swamps. Break the Ice could be a good alternative. And Spreading Seas. I mentioned in the last video, Spreading Seas has been a card that I've really enjoyed having in the board, mostly for the Saga decks. But being able to bring a Spreading Seas in, or 2 Spreading Seas in against the Eldrazi decks, gives you another way of interacting with an Eldrazi Temple or an Ugin's Lab or something earlier than Harbinger does, so it can potentially stop a big like turn 2 play if you're on the play, or stop them from ramping out into like a kicked Myco spawn or something on turn 3 if you're on the draw. So those are my recommendations for the board ins, board out. Let's get into some of the post-board mulligan decisions. What kind of hands should you be looking for when the sideboarding dust is settled and you're ready to shuffle up and present for game 2, maybe game 3? Obviously, a point of contention, because it's going to depend very greatly on what your sideboarding plan is entailing. For example, if you're bringing in a bunch of Dolphy and Consigns, then you might be trying to mull aggressively for a Dolphy hand, Dolphy plus Thoughtseize. I think that plan's a little inconsistent. It's okay as a secondary plan, but I think most of my success against Eldrazi comes again from Harbinger of the Seas and Consigned to Memory really pulling weight. Consigned to Memory paired up with an early threat, or Harbinger of the Seas paired up with the ability to find a way to close out the game after the Harbingers come down, assuming in an advantageous position. So the kind of hands that I'm looking for post board. Number one, the hyper aggressive hands. So the hands with like Thought Thief, Frog, Consign, where we're going to treat it really similar to game one, which is okay because your opponent's likely not boarding a lot if they're one of these standard builds that are showing up. So it's okay to take that same proactive game plan that gives you a good shot of winning game one and bringing it back game 2 and 3 when you have access to Consign to Memory as a better counter spell or a better spell snare. So an aggressive hand with a frog, potentially a Thought Seize, Consigned to Memory, maybe 2 Consigned to Memory. Who knows? We might be going crazy here. Or a way to get like an Oculus down with the Force Negation. All you want to keep an eye out for is your ability to hit your first couple land drops, interaction, threat. The other type of hand that I think has a pretty good success rate against Eldrazi are hands that enable and play to the strengths of Harbinger of the Seas. So obviously this would have to be a hand that's already got a Harbinger in it, so you know that that's your game plan and you can set up for it. But you need to have a couple points of contention along the line building up to Harbinger that let you know that that's the game plan you're working towards. So, for example, Spell Snare is a very important part of that game plan that might seem underwhelming because being able to interact with a talisman or a Malevolent Rumble to stop your opponent from getting access to colored mana is one of the key aspects that you need to fight over to get Harbinger to a position for it to be successful for you. What you don't want to do is let your opponent resolve a turn 2 like talisman on their side and then a rumble and you play a Harbinger and now they just got a spawn token and a talisman and they can tap that for their Kozilek's command to exile your Harbinger, make some more spawns, reset, play a big threat. So Spell Snare, really important. Force Negation, really excellent card to have in that plan because being able to interact with like a turn 1 talisman on your opponent's side off of a turn 1 Ugin's Labyrinth is really, really nice. Thoughtseize, another good one. Counter Spell as a follow up after you get a Harbinger down, or even just like preordained Thought Scour, Trespasser, Oculus, a way to get a threat after you resolve the Harbinger that will actually allow you to close out the game substantially faster than the Harbinger would. So like I said, the Harbinger is great at slowing your opponent down. It's not an I win button. It's not windmill slam Harbinger. Your opponent concedes because there's nothing they can do. They still have plenty of game left. So you need to make sure that you're not looking at it like, okay, this is in my hand. I win. On the draw. So most of those game plans are focusing on the draw. On the play. On the draw, and disruption, much more important. Counter spells, if you're looking for Harbinger, again, like if you're looking for a frog hand, having access to something like Force Negation, just like in game 1 to stop cards like Kozilek's Command, really important. But I would never keep a hand on the draw that doesn't have either a frog or a Harbinger. And the reason for that is if you keep a hand that doesn't have a threat, you run the risk, and it's such a high percentage risk of not finding a threat, spending a bunch of counter spells early on things that don't matter, trying to set up for the threat that you don't find. And you run into the situation where you don't have answers when the real threats come down, or you don't have a game plan to get the game over with. Now, I get you're not going to be able to always have a threat in your opening hand, but on the draw, I would mull down to 4 looking for a frog or a harbinger in a heartbeat, because you've got to have something going for you. Force negation is like your best card post board. Being able to play out a psychic frog on 2 or harbinger on 3, force a Kozilek's command. And we're going to talk a little bit more in the post board play patterns about when to deploy threat, but mulligan decision wise, you just got to make sure that you have something to be proactive with. If your opponent's running a build that's heavy on things like Chalice of the Void or Trinisphere, you probably want to look more aggressively for Force Negation or for Consigned to Memory, respectively. Chalice of the Void turn 1 can shut down all of like your Thought Seizes, your Unearth. Consigned to Memory can still be cast through a Chalice if you replicate it, but again, we'll cover that a little bit more. But shutting off your harbingers, or not your harbingers, your discard is a really big deal if they do have Chalice. But not too many lists are running Chalice or Trinisphere at the moment, so I wouldn't be overly worried about those. But they are important to know that you might have to adjust your game plan slightly if your opponent's playing more prison style effects, and you risk getting locked out if you're mulling too aggressively for a threat. But just the standard red-green lists, get a threat. You need to get on the board. You can't afford to sit back and try to counterspell everything from now until the end of time. You just don't have the sheer volume of counterspells to stop the things you need to counter. So you got to get the game over with. Play patterns. We already talked about a good bit of these, so I don't know how exciting this little section of the video will be, but bear with me just in case. If you're on the Harbinger plan, you're fighting over mana rocks, you're fighting over any way that they have to make colorless mana, and you want to make sure you're putting yourself in a position where if you resolve this Harbinger or put this Harbinger on the stack, your opponent can't respond with making 2 colorless mana, or worse, floating mana, let your Harbinger resolve, and then Kozilek's command exile it, because you're going to be on your own turn. You can't protect it with Force Negation, so you don't want to set yourself up to have your primary game plan just shut down because you chose to be a little impatient. So things to look for if you're on the Harbinger plan. If you are on the play and you've got a turn 3 Harbinger and your opponent has started with an Ugin's Lab and an Eldrazi Temple, you're probably not casting that Harbinger right there. The reason being, you run the issue of if your opponent just goes cast Kozilek's command in response, make 2 Eldrazi spawns, scry 2, draw a card. Now they've got their 2 lands in play. They've got 2 spawns that represent 2 colorless mana. They untap on their turn, play another land, sack off the spawns, tap the 3 lands. Now they can Kozilek's command for 3, hit your Harbinger, and draw or make 3 more spawns, whatever the case may be. But the important thing is that curve allows them to interact with your Harbinger really well. So at that moment, you really want to focus more on counterspell, consign to memory, something like that. Thought Seize, force the issue, counter it after they cast it. But you don't want to just play out the Harbinger into it and give them the chance to interact. Same thing if your opponent's got like a turn 1 or turn 2 Talisman and maybe play another Malevolent Rumble or something, and you don't have the interaction to fight over it, then you don't really want to slam the Harbinger into the Talisman and the Eldrazi spawn off the Rumble and a few land drops, because you just run the risk of them having the Kozilek's command. If you do have the ability to play out a Harbinger at a point where your opponent cannot Kozilek's command your Harbinger on the end of your turn, but can on theirs. You have a little leeway if you have Force of Negation in hand to be able to let them resolve one on your turn, go to their turn, cast another, force it. Because if they do that and they sack their spawns off to cast it, then you can potentially just like lock them out of colorless mana on the spot right there. But that's only if you have a Force Negation. And I probably wouldn't try too aggressively for that line unless you also have a counter spell or consign to memory, something that you can cast on your turn if they pass back to you and try to go for the Kozilek's Return on your turn so that you can fight over the Kozilek's Return or Kozilek's Command on your turn, pass to them, and have Force Negation back up on their turn for a follow-up like Karn the Great Creator. Speaking of Kozilek's Return, yes, the Wrath effect, I'm getting words eventually correct, is a card to be in consideration of with Utopia Sprawl and the Talisman. They can produce red mana to cast Kozilek's Return to take out Harbinger of the Seas, or worse, if they have a Kozilek's Return in their graveyard off of something like a Malevolent Rumble or casting one early, then any of their big Eldrazi triggers it from the graveyard to exile and wipe like Oculus and tokens and Harbinger, all that. You can consign to memory the Kozilek's Command trigger from the graveyard. It'll stay in the graveyard, but they won't get to 5 damage everything, or the Kozilek's, I can't remember which one I said, the Kozilek's Return trigger from the graveyard. It'll stay in the graveyard, but you don't have to worry about them wrathing your board right there. Comes up a lot more against the versions with Null Drifter because they can evoke the Null Drifter. It counts as a big Eldrazi for Kozilek's Return and trigger it off of that. So if you have the mana available to like consign to memory to stop the draw and stop the Kozilek's Command or Kozilek's Return, then that's a pretty nice play that you can have access to from time to time. Priority list for consigned to memory post board is almost the exact same as the Thoughtseize priority list. Devourer of Destiny is like the big thing that you want to hit because being able to consign and replicate on it means stopping one of the biggest bodies you have to worry about, as well as the exile effect on one of your threats. Kozilek's Command is number 2. I'd rather use like a counter spell on it or a Force Negation, but if I have to use a consign to keep like a frog alive on turn 3, absolutely will do that. And then Emrakul again, number 3, because it's the thing that just ends the game if it resolves. Because these are open deck list events, there's usually not going to be a lot of gotcha moments. Both players are kind of going to know, like, you've got access to Harbinger of the Seas, you're wanting to resolve that, or you've got Spreading Seas, you're wanting to resolve these. So the chances of your opponent putting themselves in a bad position to just lose to Harbinger are a lot lower. That is one of the reasons that I like Spreading Seas a little bit more post-board, because Spreading Seas doesn't really care if your opponent knows about it or not. If they keep a hand that's heavy on forests and Utopia Sprawls, then Spreading Seas can turn the forest into an island, the Utopia Sprawl falls off, or it can come down, like I said, a turn sooner to help fight over a temple or an Ugin's Labyrinth. It's a lot less all-encompassing, obviously, but can be equally effective if you're able to, say, cut your opponent off green early by combining a Spreading Seas with an interactive spell on a Talisman, or cut them off double colorless early by taking out a Soul Land. Finally, Myco Spawn gets a really big buff on the priority list for cards like Consign to Memory if your opponent has Cavern of Souls in the deck, because there's obviously no guarantee that you're going to get a Harbinger or it's going to be able to stick around. But if they have a Cavern of Souls, there's a really good chance they're going to tutor it up early. So if you can consign that trigger, that's something to pay attention for. Otherwise, I'm typically ignoring Myco spawn a pretty good bit. Sometimes they'll go and get a Bajuka Bog or a card that kind of acts as a one-time grave hate piece. Sometimes they'll go get a Sanctum of Ugin, whatever. Don't care about those. I'm waiting for the Devourer or the Emrakul or that 8-mana artifact creature, the Cityscape Leveler, and trying to aggressively save my consigned memories for those effects and leave some of the small fry around. Now they have the card Writhing Chrysalis showing up in some lists, a Pauper All-Star, and probably one of, if not the best limited common in a while. Like, card is phenomenal in MH3 limited. It's kind of cool to see it getting the nod in some constructed lists at the moment. So the Chrysalis does allow your opponent to play out a 4-mana play that allows them to ramp up to 7 mana in one turn cycle. So it's good. It's got the ability to get bigger if they sack some spawns to it. So with things like Kozilek's command making spawns, or the Chrysalis itself makes 2 spawns when it's cast, it can grow pretty big, and it does have reach, so you got to keep an eye out for that. It could be a reason that you want to leave in 1 removal spell, maybe 2 Fatal Push or something post-board, just to fight over that a little bit. I'll kind of leave that up to you. I haven't gotten enough games in against the Chrysalis yet, so I don't want to say for sure one way or the other, but it could be a reason to consign something besides a big payoff if you're able to fight over it a little bit earlier. So yeah, that's it for the post-board play patterns. Let's get into some of the matchup specific tips and tricks. Kind of looking down the list and realizing we've gone over a good bit of these. The Eldrazi matchup really doesn't have many opportunities to like outplay your opponent or have a gotcha moment. There's a lot more chances in an online event where the deck lists aren't open, but at an RC, you're going to know all of the tricks your opponent has available. They're going to know everything you've got. It's really going to be about forming that game plan before you even sit down at the table and really trying to enact that to the best of your ability. Some of the things I did have down here, like Harbinger of the Seas, Spreading Seas, being able to snipe a non-basic forest that have Utopia Sprawl in the case of Harbinger, or Spreading Seas can snipe any land with Utopia Sprawl, can set your opponent back a good bit. Talked about Kozilek's Return not using the stack, so if they cast a big Eldrazi with the Kozilek's Return in the graveyard, a trigger will be created that they can choose to exile the Kozilek's Return or not. Once they choose, you do not have an opportunity to do anything. Can't respond in any way. So, ability goes on the stack. You can respond to that ability, but as soon as that ability resolves, they get to choose, and there's nothing you can do. You can't like start discarding to Frog after they've chosen to exile the Kozilek's Return. So if they do put a return on the stack or a return trigger on the stack, make sure you are responding to that with, say, discarding to a Frog. But you can consign, again, the Kozilek's Return trigger. Devourer of Destiny and All is Dust both specify permanents with 1 or more color. Applies to 98% of your deck, does not apply to manifests that you make off of Abhorrent Oculus. So if you see that your opponent has got a Devourer of Destiny in hand, you've got a quick Oculus, there's a pretty good chance that you can just save a consigned memory by not going after that Devourer trigger if you can get around it with enough manifest tokens. But if you've got something like an Oculus that's staring down and something important face down while your opponent has a Devourer, you can leave that card face down a little bit longer to protect it from being exiled with the Devourer. It doesn't come up too much, but it's just good to know. Mention understanding the timing when you're playing Harbinger of the Seas so that your opponent can't just like Kozilek's command it, float mana, Kozilek's command it, untap, have all their mana. We mentioned discarding and surveilling before your opponent gets to steal a card or steal a turn from you with Emrakul. Consign to memory has a few extra kind of useful targets that are nice to know. For example, Bajuka Bog makes a target. So if they go get a Bajuka Bog off of a Sowing Myco spawn, you can consign that target to exile your graveyard or that trigger to exile your graveyard. I would only do it if you had like another consign in hand or like an unearth with an Oculus in the yard. You can consign the imprint trigger on Ugin's Labyrinth. So if you're on the play, your opponent plays a turn 1 Ugin's Labyrinth and you want to slow them down, you can consign that imprint trigger, stop them from playing like a turn 1 Talisman. Again, I would only consider it if you had like turn 2 Frog, turn 3 another consign or Thoughtseize counterspell or something to take advantage of that turn you bought yourself. I wouldn't just consign it for the sake of consigning it. And you can consign the sack trigger off Ugin's or Sanctum of Ugin. So if they cast a big Eldrazi, sack their Sanctum to go look for something else, you can consign the Sanctum of Ugin. It works a lot better when your opponent casts a big Eldrazi, stacks, Sanctum trigger goes on the stack, they sack it to go look for something, and you can consign to memory and counter the Sanctum trigger, the Eldrazi cast trigger, and the Eldrazi. That's like the big blowout replicate option. And the last thing I just mentioned or wanted to mention was the frog snowball. If you're watching this video before you're watching the Breach, the Underworld Breach guide, then this is a good turn sequence to be aware of. If you've got a turn 2 frog down and you're trying to get the game over with as quickly as you can just discard like your entire hand, say discard 5 cards to the frog and make it a 3-turn clock, but you really run the risk of your interaction not lining up if you discard your entire hand to start off and don't draw into anything you need. So instead, there's kind of this snowball. You can accumulate damage over the first few turns you got a frog out. So you got a frog on turn 2. On turn 3, if you discard 2 cards to the frog, then you're going to hit your opponent for 3 down to 17, draw a card. Turn 4, you discard 1 more card, hit them for 4 down to 13. Turn after that, you discard 2 cards, hit them for 6 down to 7. Turn after that, turn 6 at this point, you discard 1 more, hit them for the 7. It allows you to keep the interactive spells in your hand. We'll go over the math of it here in a second. While also putting enough cards in the graveyard to be able to fly the frog multiple times. So if you need to get over a Myco spawn or some spawn tokens on the ground, you can do that. But the way the math works out is if I've got an opening hand of 7 cards and I've got 2 lands that I got to play out for the frog, 1 more is the frog itself, and on that 3rd turn I discard 2 cards, I'm down to 2 in hand. This could be like Force Negation blue card, this could be Thoughtseize Consign, something like that. I hit my opponent, draw up to 3, or let's backtrack. 7 cards, draw on the 2nd turn. 7 cards, play land on the 1st turn, draw on the 2nd turn, play a land on the second turn, play a frog on the second turn, draw a card on the third turn, discard 2 to the frog, hit your opponent, go back up to 5. They're at 17. Draw a card on the fourth turn, discard 1 to the frog, or 1 to the frog, hit them for 4 down to 13. Draw a card. The turn after that, draw for turn, discard 2 to the frog, hit them. You might be able to kill them there. But either way, you keep cards available in your hand while not having to overextend and throw everything into the frog. And yeah, you can make like land drop in there, Thoughtseize plus counterspell, because you have cards available to you. So you're not overextending, but you are getting the game over with substantially quicker than if you just hit your opponent for like 1 or 2 every turn. I'm sure someone can come up with a better formula for getting your opponent dead with the frog, but I think this is kind of the way that lets you keep the most interaction possible and the most options, but flip the switch and get the game over with when that situation arises. But if you've got an opening hand with just like 7 cards that are 2 lands, frog, Thoughtseize, double consign, then I would just proceed to discard every card that you draw off for turn or hand either one, or draw for turn or draw for frog to the frog, get the game over with as soon as you possibly can, and kind of ride those consigns to victory instead of worrying too much about the details. But that's about all I got. Like I said, it's a very straightforward matchup. It's all about your ability to recognize your game plan and enact it, and not so much about trying to be too reactive to what your opponent's got going on. Hopefully that helps out. As always, if you enjoy the video, feel free to leave a comment. Let me know. Consider liking and subscribing. Let me know if any of these tips are helping out with you. Maybe they pick you up a win and you can attribute a little bit of success here. Always cool to hear about. Otherwise, links down below to things like the Discord, socials, if you want to come check out some of the other content we have going on, or if you want to talk about the deck list, things that you're seeing in the matchup or in the league. Great place to reach out. Other than that, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe, enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.